Hi, this is Jim from Trek World, and join me today as we venture into one of those ghosts of Trek past.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The Enterprise Flight Manual was created in early 1978 during pre-production of Star Trek Phase 2. At that time, Paramount publicly was moving full steam ahead towards relaunching the franchise as a weekly series on a new fourth network, to be named the Paramount Television Service. Even though the show never quite made it before the cameras, its development generated an avalanche of design work, props, scripts, and yes, even manuals. Now, this manual bears the date February 1978, which is crucial. By then, Paramount had already invested in sets, models, and pre-production documentation. But within a single month, the plan for Phase 2 collapsed in March, replaced by a new strategy to launch a feature film, Star Trek, the motion picture. With Phase 2, the bridge was pretty much redesigned from the original series layout, and every console had new light patterns, new touch switches, and new displays. The manual served as a how-to for both functionality and performance. Now, it's important to remember that it wasn't meant for public eyes. Copies circulated amongst the cast, designers, and production staff only. When Phase 2 was shelved, most of the copies of this were filed away or discarded. The communications console in Phase 2 carried a far greater level of detail than what Nichelle Nichols had to work with in the 1960s. In the original series, Uhura's job was often limited to flipping random switches and listening to audio cues piped through her earpiece. But in 1978, the production team wanted the communications position on the bridge to feel as sophisticated as the rest of the redesigned Enterprise. The console contained multiple practical rows of touch switches. That meant that these switches were live. When the actor or her stand-in pressed one, the panel would respond with the change in lighting. This gave her consistent, repeatable actions to perform on screen, rather than just improvising random button presses. While the prop itself was all smoke and mirrors, the intent was to anchor the performance in a believable semi-technical behavior. It was less about what the audience literally saw, and more about consistency across multiple episodes. Now, in the original series, life support was usually just a throwaway line, a background system mentioned somewhere where oxygen was failing or a hull breach threatened a compartment. On the 1960s bridge, no panel was ever specifically tied to this function. But in 1978, with Phase 2, the production crew wanted every corner of the Enterprise to feel like it had a definable operational purpose. The manual described the station's role as nothing less than the regulation of shipboard habitability. Now, this would include the oxygen circulation system, carbon dioxide scrubbing, thermal regulation, artificial gravity balance, humidity control, and even emergency quarantine protocols. Each of these was tied to a set of labeled panels. Weapons and Defense Station, Chekov's console, in other words, is perhaps the most elaborate section of the Enterprise Flight Manual. Unlike in the original series, where Chekov sometimes doubled as a navigator and tactical officer without a clear distinction, Phase 2 established him firmly as the weapons officer with a fully detailed operations panel. The manual described in technical clarity how photon torpedoes and phasers were to be armed and fired during dramatic sequences. For the actor, this was a choreographed series of actions. The beauty of all of this was consistency. If a script in Episode 4 called for a 2-torpedo spread, Koenig would perform the exact same physical motions as he did in Episode 9. The results gave fans, who, trust me, we would notice these details, the sense that Starfleet weapons truly operated in a common design language. What began here as an internal manual for an aborted TV show? Well, I guess you could say it became the DNA of future technologies used in Trek. In the original series, Scotty often worked in the engine room set. The glowing tube, the power conduits, the big flashing reactor cores. But in Phase 2, engineering was given a dedicated bridge station to tie directly into Starship operations. Now, engineering could tie into the bridge in the original series, but did not do so often. If Scotty needed to divert power to the shields, the instructions would be that he should toggle panel 16, which was wired to turn on corresponding lights at panel 4. The illusion was that panel 16 was the master switch, and then panel 4 then responded with new readouts. It emphasized the actor's gestures need to be consistent across episodes, so like with the other stations, the same switches for the same functions. A bridge between acting and real engineering procedures. The tractor beam station was positioned on the starboard side of the bridge layout, close to weapons and defense. The manual described it as a control hub for one of the Enterprise's most distinctive but underexplored technologies. Now, the tractor beam panel contained 2 primary toggle banks and a set of circular beam strength indicators. The first toggle row controlled beam activation and lock-on. The top switch turned the tractor on, the bottom switch turned it off. A secondary toggle adjusted the beam's mode, hold versus tow. The circular indicators were wired to respond to actor input, lighting up sequentially to simulate increasing or decreasing power. And I know you've all been waiting for this one. Let's talk about the science station. In the original series, he often improvised what he was looking at, glancing into the iconic hooded viewer or pressing blinking colored lights. But Phase 2's manual codified the procedure. It explained with diagrams what each part of the science console was supposed to represent. The upper scope banks, for example, were labeled in the manual as being used for long-range stellar cartography and sensor fusion. Production originally planned to achieve this effect by inserting backlit transparencies into the viewer. But the manual doesn't just stop at visuals. It also, as before, created a button choreography. If the script called for Spock to conduct a long-range scan, Nimoy would press the leftmost toggle on the science panel before leaning into the viewer. If he was analyzing lifeform readings, the manual would instruct him to touch the second toggle from the right. Even if the audience never noticed this, the consistency would have given a more reliable physical vocabulary for his role. Now, the document also included notes for some practical controls, switches that were actually wired to respond. We'd seen these before. These were real touch-sensitive pads located just before the viewer. When pressed, they would illuminate briefly, giving real feedback during filming. This was critical. He didn't want to look like he was randomly fiddling with lights. He wanted to embody the calm, exacting nature of a Vulcan science officer. If the actor pressed a control for sensor scan, an offset operator would trigger a blinking series of lights in the overhead display. The illusion was it's commanding an actual process, but in truth, it was an orchestrated dance between actor and crew. The collaboration, anchored in the manual, of course, foreshadowed how Trek would later approach Starfleet technology as a carefully rehearsed system. Navigation was separated clearly from the helm in the original Phase 2 designs, and the manual reinforced this by detailing how the navigator and helmsman were supposed to interact. Sulu and Chekov often overlapped duties, with one setting a course and the other executing it. But the Phase 2 manual formalized the process. Navigation lays in the course. Helm executes. The navigation console was described as containing coordinate input pads and direct and trajectory plotting lights. These were practical in the sense that certain switches were wired to respond when touched. If the script were to call for laying in a course to Alpha Centauri, the actor would press the left pad, which would cause an overhead indicator to glow. Then, and only then, would the helmsman perform his action, pressing his corresponding title to engage the course. The manual stressed the sequence here was non-negotiable. It was written in bold. Nav inputs before helm engages. We can't, however, talk about one side without talking about the other. Let's take a look at the Helm Station, occupied by Sulu. It's another example of a push for standardization. The Helm was described as having multiple layers for impulse systems, warp systems, and for your inboard operations. Console number 1, impulse systems. The console was dedicated to short-range propulsion. The manual described it as housing the controls for fusion reactors, impulse drive regulators, and sublight maneuvering jets. Console 2 was the most complex and dramatic of the engineering panels. It controlled the warp core, the matter-antimatter injectors, and nacelle power transfer conduits. Console 3, the four-year auxiliary control console. This was a catch-all console located near the entrance to the engine room set. The flight manual described it as handling secondary system regulation, backup power routing, and auxiliary thruster controls. In other words, it was where an engineer could reroute power around damaged systems or manage non-critical ship functions. Even the briefing room console got an upgrade. The central table, according to the manual, included a small console interface that allowed officers to call up data, control the main display screen, and record or transmit mission logs. The console was to be positioned at one end of the table and was diagrammed in the manual as containing several rows of touch-sensitive controls. The manual devoted an entire section to the transporter room. The console was divided into 3 functional zones: targeting and lock controls, pattern buffer activation, and finally, we have the energized controls. Now, the flight manual also described Captain Kirk's quarters as more than just living space. It was also a personal command annex, a place that Kirk could review mission logs, communicate privately with Starfleet, and even exert limited control over ship functions. Unlike the bridge stations, this console wasn't bristling with toggles and levers. It was designed to look sleek and minimal, emphasizing the role as a support system rather than a primary control hub. One set of buttons was dedicated to private communications. Pressing the comm toggle activated a secure line to the bridge or to Starfleet Command. Another toggle marked record allowed Kirk to dictate directly into the ship's log with a light illuminating to show active recording. The console also provided mission data access, another row of switches that would allow the actor to call up star charts, personnel files, or mission briefs on the wall screen in his quarters. While sickbay had always been part of the original series, its consoles were often nothing more than background decoration. In Phase 2, the manual elevated medical to the same operational seriousness as Helm or engineering. As seen before, the manual describes 3 main components: the examination room, the medical transporter, and the bedside monitors. The examination room featured a scan console, which was wired with practical switches so that the actor could press them with confidence, knowing they would light up. The manual stressed that the actor should always begin a diagnostic by pressing the leftmost switch, then work their way across the row. This gave his actions the consistency of a doctor following a medical checklist. Now, the flight manual described the examining room as the point of contact between Starfleet medicine and the patient. At its heart was the scan console, a compact wall-mounted unit with a bank of toggles and a diagnostic readout display beside the patient bed. It wasn't meant to look like a computer terminal in the modern sense. Instead, it was designed to feel like a fusion of 23rd century medicine and shipboard systems, with blinking lights, sliding switches, and small status indicators. The medical transporter was an innovation unique to Phase 2. It was described as a panel with practical touch panels that could beam patients directly from sickbay to other parts of the ship. While the prop didn't actually do anything, it gave the actor a series of button presses that simulated a real medical evacuation. And this technology did in fact show up in later treks. There's the piece of Starfleet medical that we see most often. These were the blinking light boxes mounted beside sickbay beds. The manual noted that every touch switch on these monitors was practical. This meant the actor could point to a flashing readout, press a switch, and have the lights change in response. This allowed him to read patient vitals in real time, anchoring his dialogue in believable stage business.